Seeing a bizarre creature for your very own eyes while alone in the woods with your friend must be a dreadful and horrific experience. Two men who worked together in a Mississippi shipyard called Ingalls in the 70s, named Charles and Kelvin, they decided to meet up and go fishing along the bank of the Pascagoula River. Upon arriving, though, Calvin saw a few different signs posted along the way of the trail. And they said that if anybody were to go fishing in those waters, they were subject to fines, maybe even get arrested. And he told Charles this, but Charles just told him, don't worry about it, man. Any cops are going to be far away and we're going to be long gone before anyone has a chance to see or catch. But it didn't last very long because after just about 15 minutes of them waiting for a bite on their lines, Kelvin, he off into the distance, saw a pair of blue lights coming towards them, and he just thought, oh man, we messed up. It's the cops. They're coming for us. But something struck Kelvin, and he knew that that light, although it was coming at them at a high rate of speed, it wasn't the police that were coming after the two men to arrest them for trespassing and illegally fishing along the shore, because both of them started covering their ears, feeling this sharp, searing pain, almost as if their ears were about to bleed, because coming from those lights was a deep, sharp humming sound that wasn't police sirens at all. Then, when Calvin was able to grasp himself and refocus his sighting on whatever this was in front of them, he noticed this large vehicle-looking object hurtling towards them, almost crashing right into them. But it stopped right there, just a few feet in front of them, almost 10 feet above the ground, hovering in the air. And it was a vehicle, but not a man-made vehicle. And in that moment, it dawned on them. That object was a spacecraft. And they couldn't do anything about it either besides just look at it, because they also felt a force of energy radiating from this spacecraft that trapped them right there in their tracks, unable to move or do anything. They started to see the blue lights out of it start to dim just a little bit, just enough that they could see from the entrance of this ship 3 large, bulky, human-like figures that were hovering outside of it. These beings were described by Calvin to have a very pale, very wrinkly type of looking skin, and in place of their nose and ears, they had these spike sort of limbs sticking out of their heads, and in place of their hands, they had giant claws. Still frozen right where they were when the ship arrived right in front of them, these beings started to enforce that same energy that was coming out of the ship onto the two men. They started to make them levitate off the ground. They went about 4 feet up when these beings started to drag them into the ship. Both Charles and Calvin were still in this paralyzed kind of state, but they were still conscious. They could still see and hear, and they could start to hear these beings talk to each other, making these sort of clicking sounds and a very fogged vision that this ship gave them. Then they realized that these beings were going up to them. They were extending their claws and their limbs that were protruding out of their head, starting to touch the men all over their bodies with those limbs. Onto Calvin's first, his chest, and as it was hovering over, examining his body, Calvin got a good look at it, and on the end of it, there was this glossy piece to it. He realized this thing had eyes. One eyeball. Nothing that they could do besides just accept their fate. And that's exactly what they did for 30 minutes, because that's how long this entire encounter lasted. But eventually, they just stopped. Calvin and Charles both heard them beginning those clicking sounds again, assuming that these alien creatures were speaking amongst each other. Within just a couple of seconds of the men now standing on their very 2 feet back on the Earth's surface, just happy to be alive, they turned back around, saw the blue lights that were pulsating out of this ship grow into their full luminosity of brightness, almost blinding them. And almost in one instant, at a high rate of speed once again, this alien spaceship zoomed out into the darkness of the night, into the skies, and just faded away, disappeared. And the men looked at each other, speechless, not saying a word, just staring at each other in shock. No more desire to go fishing after that. They just looked at each other and knew, that's it, we're going home. So they started packing up their stuff, got all of their fishing gear, and left on foot, just walking back home. And after that night, they woke up fresh the next day, still knowing exactly what happened to them that previous night, encountering these UFO alien beings. And after their shift at that same shipyard, they said, you know what? We have to say something. So they went to the Keesler Air Force Base in the nearby area and tried to report the incident. Tried. The thing is, these military personnel did hear them out. For 10 minutes, they listened to them explain back and forth in detail anything that they could remember or muster up in the moment. But they didn't believe anything. In fact, they brushed them off and said, hey guys, if this was a real encounter, and if you truly felt like you were in danger, don't report it to us. So instead, they pushed them off to the side to go and report it to the Jackson County Police Department. And they arrived there in a straight up panic, completely flustered, completely frustrated that nobody in the military had believed them, because if anybody could have helped them and done something about UFOs, it would have been the Air Force or the military at all. He pulled them off into an interrogation room just to try and set everything straight. You know, the kind with the one-way window where on the other side they can be watched by investigators and not have any clue about it. Throughout their explanations, they were both hysterical and reiterating multiple parts of their story in all of these different randomized orders because they were still in a panic. And when they were going through the stories, they explained it all, the blue lights, their ears in pain from this shearing, humming, sharp noise, all of it, including that little detail where Kelvin explained that the robotic eyeball was just that, robotic in movement, yet human as nature. And that little detail stuck out to the sheriff. Is it a robot, or is it an alien, or is it a wrinkly human? And he didn't believe them just off of that one little miscalculated sort of explanation that sounded to him like they got their stories a little confused. He said, you guys need to get this straightened out. I don't believe a word you're saying, so I'm going to leave you to it for a little bit. And without the men knowing, he left a recorder in there and walked out. But he was on the other side, watching them explain to each other what their story was, and every little detail they explained to each other was accurate. And the sheriff started to understand if these men were crazy, if they were making this up, their story together alone, it adds up, all of it. So he connected both of them to the lie detector test in that same moment, in that same room, one right after another, and they both passed it with flying colors. But still, nobody had any evidence besides these two men reenacting and recounting what they had experienced from these UFO beings in that spaceship that was at that coast of the water. Everybody called them crazy. It got so bad that Kelvin, being a young 18-year-old man, his life was ruined in that small town. He even had to relocate to another state, start a whole new career, a new job where nobody knew who he was. It demolished their entire perception around the world and their reputation as a result. It wasn't until 50 years later that a woman named Maria was there in that area of the Pascagoula River that night, in the same vicinity as where all of this was taking place. And once she saw the story of the sheriff interrogating the men come out in the newspapers, it was 50 years later that she came out and went to that same police station saying, hey, I was there that night. Maria was there that same night, about a quarter-mile away down the river, where she was waiting for her husband to leave for work at the same shipyard. She was waiting for him to aboard a ship, and while she was waiting, well, she saw a blue streak of lights and heard that same searing sound that made her ears hurt. And deep into the distance, she heard the men encountering these beings, and she never came out to say anything in those 50 years because she heard about the ridicule, how these men were called crazy, how it ruined their lives, and she didn't want the same thing to happen to her. Her husband even told her that she can't just come out and say this. He didn't even believe her. He told her, "You know, if you tell anyone about this, your life is over. People are going to call you insane and crazy." It turns out that all three of them had experienced something otherworldly that night.